Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show issue number 53.
Boom!
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show issue 53. I'm your host, John Cimino, with the big boy, Thanos himself, Steve, and below we got Niall. Niall, tell us what's going on the Pop XP.
Well, first and foremost, I missed you guys. I'm happy to be recording with you right now. But as everyone knows the house rules, please look below, click that subscribe button, and smash that bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content like this interview tonight. And gentlemen, I'm excited. It's about to get rowdy and Riley, and who knows what's going to happen.
Oh, who knows? Who knows? Steve, we always get the best guests, and this guy that we got he is a legend, but I have to say, if there's anybody that could be like a comedian with the driest, most honest, and controversial humor ever, he's a throwback to those, to the Sam Kinnisons or the Andrew Dice Clays that just did not care. He's got no filter, and I absolutely love it. But sometimes you don't know if he's going to push you off that cliff or he's only joking around. But man, he's got incredible talent, incredible humor. I love the guy. But what can we talk about with today's guest?
Well, today's guest has been able to survive in the industry, which is very, very cutthroat, does not like older people, but Mr. Howard Chaykin has somehow managed to keep surviving, going on through different eras when other people are falling by the wayside. But Howard keeps chugging along with a new project every now and again. And what makes it even more sensational, of course, is that we are now in the era of woke and very sensitive people. And Mr. Howard is the most unwoke person that we will probably ever speak to. So it's going to be a fascinating little conversation here today.
And just so you know, when I was telling Roy, I was like, we got Howard Chaykin coming on. He goes, don't get him too riled up. We don't know what's going to happen. So I love it. And that's what I have to do. Oh, yeah. And an incredible talent at that. What, Niall? What'd you say?
So that's what we want. We want honesty. We want to hear. We want to talk. We want to get down to the nitty gritty. And I have to say it, Steve. We want to dive into the weeds.
Oh, wait a minute. There's many copyrights involved in that little thing right there.
I'm going to have shirts made for the merch. That's going to be your face. It's going to say, let's dive into the weeds.
But yeah, so we got a great guest and a legend. And he is, let's just be honest, like an incredible artist, and a unique talent too. And he seems to be in the thread of a Gil Kane. If I have to say so myself, he has that Gil Kane type of style. And if I'm incorrect, we'll have to ask him about it. So, Niall, why don't we bring out the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Howard Chaykin.
I don't know what the fuck you people are talking about. You are so clearly off base. Comparing me to Andrew Dice Clay, to Sam Kinison. Come on. These guys are these people are performative reprobates. I am my goal in life is to channel Lenny Bruce and Gore Vidal. And frankly, and again, I'm not funny. I just published a piece today which indicated that I'm not funny. I'm clever. I'm quick. I'm sharp and I'm witty. But I'm not comedy hijinks funny. I don't tell jokes. I can't tell jokes. I don't know how to tell jokes. I don't know any jokes. I know 3 jokes, none of which are appropriate for public display. And and to tell you the truth, when you use the word woke the way you did, Steve, I've spent the past 5 or so years being, trapped between one side of the equation and the other. Hold on a second, my editor's calling. I'm gonna have to call you back. I'm being dealt with on a StreamYard interview. Can I call you back in about an hour?
Of course.
I will. The reality is that the left wing regards people like me as lost causes. The right wing regards people like me as potential allies, and you're both fucked. They're both completely wrong. I'm people like me. I'm neither your ally nor a lost cause. I operate from a perspective that does not take a disagreement as an execution. And that's just, it seems to me, I'm deeply secular in every way, and that secularity informs the way I deal with people's politics as well. And I'm not particularly interested in anybody other than me. I used to be good looking enough to be a narcissist. Now I'm simply a solipsist. And my self-obsession is guileful, not guileless. I'm perfectly comfortable that I'm the only game that I care about. So go with God. Keep talking. Tell me more.
Well, Howard,
welcome to my studio. Here we are. This is it. My dogs are walking around wondering who I'm talking to right now. It's kind of exciting.
But Howard, what I meant by Andrew and during that time period, they just kind of said what they wanted to say, and
Nah, I mean, Kinnison was just a drug addict and a drunk who killed himself. And Andrew Dice Clay was a pathetic comedian who found a voice, a nice Jewish boy who pretended to be Italian.
Yeah, but I was waiting for you to mention Lenny Bruce, since that every single person I've ever met of a certain age group always brings up that name. So Bruce, it definitely it's an all-consuming thing. It covers all the bases of you want to get into trouble, Lenny Bruce.
I love the fact that Luke Kirby, the Canadian actor, is playing him on Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, a show I stopped watching after the 3rd season because it was such bullshit. But it's like Lenny Bruce on Pilates. It was like when Tom Hiddleston played Hank Williams. Hank Williams on Pilates. It's really good. But yeah, I mean, to a great extent, my entire approach to life is informed by having spent that much time watching television throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. My parents split up when I was very young, and I was allowed to free reign to stay up all night watching TV. So I ended up, my education was watching the Steve Allen Show and the Jack Parr Show. Guys like Hans Conried, Alexander King, Dodie Goodman, Genevieve, Jonathan Winters. These guys really informed the way I think. And to a profound extent, that's the world I came up in, and it is my world now. When you use the word controversial or problematic, it implies that it's an inviolable absolute, that it is a thing that exists into and of itself, like black and white. And the reality is, what is controversial today is going to be perfectly acceptable tomorrow in some context. And what is acceptable today is going to be looked upon with awe and dismay in 5, 10, 15 years. Culture changes and culture shifts. And I'm old enough to have been around for those cultural shifts and been aware of them and be more amused by them than motivated, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, fuck everybody, to tell you the truth. I mean, if I cared about what other people thought of me, I'd kill myself. It's none of my business. I'd like to be loved, but it's too much work,
Okay, speaking of watching those late night TV shows, there had to be a time in there that you came across a comic book or something that when did you discover that you were such a good artist and all that?
I was never a good artist. I became an artist the same way Gil Kane became an artist. He taught himself and I taught myself. I discovered comic books when I was 4 years old. I had 2 cousins, Bobby and Alan Carenti, my mother's sister's kids, whose mother decided that she had to get rid of all their comics. So they gave them to me. They had a refrigerator box half filled with comics. This is the summer of 1955. And I've told the story many times, but I can still bring up the smell and sense memory of that paper. And I climbed into the box, and I had an epiphany comparable to Saul's on the road to Damascus. I realized, that someone had made these things. Then I wanted to be that someone who made those things. And within a year, I was able to read on a 4th grade level, because I couldn't say the words. When I read Tarzan and the Apes years later, and Tarzan taught himself to speak by looking at the children's books that his parents had bought for him before they died, I understood completely how he had taught himself to read, because I did the same thing. I couldn't pronounce invulnerable. I couldn't pronounce indestructible. But I could parse out the context and dynamic of the language by dint of the pictures that associated them. So my parents, who were fucking morons, thought I was some sort of genetic anomaly that needed to be restrained and contained. And they never connected the fact that comic books had taught me to read. Okay. And I've been a comic book man since I was 4. And that's all I've ever wanted to be. It's all I've ever wanted to do. Wow. It's a weird lowball ambition, because basically the older I got, the less respect I had for the content and more love for the form. And I came up at a time when people still discussed the form, when you dealt with the language. I mean, my generation were the first post-war generation. We were the guy. I mean, there was this very brief, minimal trio of guys. Well, it was Roy, Neil, Steranko, Tom Palmer, and a couple of other cats who were that age. But most of the guys were born in the 20s, as opposed to the late 30s, early 40s. My generation was born in the late 40s, early 50s. I was the youngest in my generation. And we talked about form. We talked about context, not content. You know, we didn't care about whether it was Superman or monsters or any of that bullshit. We were discussing the language. We wanted to understand the syntax of how you did what we did and why. And that has just vanished for a number of reasons, which I'm perfectly aware of. But I spent a great deal of time talking to people of my generation and younger as well about that language, about that syntax, about why comics are special. And the very specialness of comics is, of course, lost in every way as comics have become a profound part of mass media. Because the one thing that makes comics special has been left behind. And that's the page. The very idea of a page in comics preceded by a page and followed by a page. That relationship of triptych, that turning of page, the engine provided by the reader, that is what makes comics separate and special. All the superhero junk, all the wizards and dragons and monsters, all that bullshit, that's just content that's aimed at a fucking moron audience. The smart audience is looking at this stuff and saying, why is this stuff work? As much as Daniel Close has contempt for me and the work that he thinks I do and for the market in which I function, he at least has an interest, innate, in an understanding of why the material works. The same is true of Art Spiegelman. I loathe Spiegelman. If Spiegelman thinks of me at all, he regards me as a bug under his shoes. But the truth of the matter is, he has an intellectual interest in the value of the language. And most comic book fans do not. They don't give a fuck about that shit. And to me, that's the most important thing about comics there are.
Wow.
Long answer to a short question, babe.
But yeah, go ahead, Steve. Good.
So, we've had, various, professionals on this show, and I always like to get into the weeds, as we say, in regards to that first time that you picked up a pen or a pencil and tried to draw, because, anyone in my industry that I know at one point did try. Everyone who is here is like, oh, I can do this. You saw the comics. I can do that. And 99.9% of people can't, me being one of them. So at what point did you realize that, wait a minute, I think I'm actually pretty good at this. I think I can draw. And when did other people say, wait a minute, you're good? If you started reading at 4, when did that realization take place?
Well, I started drawing immediately, but I wasn't really any good. I drew on my own fantasy life, which I was born in Jersey, raised in Brooklyn, and my fantasy life revolved around cowboy pictures. It was back in those days, if you're in Channel 13 in New York City, which is now the PBS station, was a low-rent shithole station out of Hackensack, New Jersey, that showed nothing but cowboy pictures at night and cartoons during the day. We lost John.
Yeah, we just lost John. Maybe he accidentally hit the button or something and signed out.
John has those issues. We have to deal with. Let's have a moment of silence for John.
Yeah.
Let's make fun of him. The moment is over. Let's make fun of him. So I started drawing all. He's back. I started drawing all this stuff that I cared about, and I didn't really think I could actually make my living at this until I was in my teens. When before I went to look for work at Gil Kane, I was picking up stray dollars drawing pretty girl heads for beauty salons in my neighborhood. Okay, they were terrible. They were basically romance comics girl heads. Alex Toth, a little bit of Dan DeCarlo, a little bit of a Doug Snade. But I could draw the shape of haircuts for women in the 1960s, and that's actually a skill set that has remained with me. I mean, anecdotally, only a couple of years ago, my wife and I were in town in New York City, and we saw a really shitty show that we expected to love that was really terrible. And it took place. It took place in the 1930s and ended in the 1960s. And as we were booking, I turned to my wife and said, "My takeaway from this piece of shit is that I can fake a woman's dress from 1935 to 1965 without reference. I can just pull it out of my head, and I can do that." But I didn't get any good until I was in my late 20s and early 30s, because I got work in the beginning of my career under false pretenses, and I was really hungry, and I was informed by anger and by hunger and rage, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I was all over the place. When people talk about my early work, but they're responding not to the work that I did, but to the work was done in service of. All those people who love the Star Wars comic book love the Star Wars comic because it's about Star Wars. They would love it if I'd drawn it with my ass. It's just, they don't care about the quality of the craft involved in making it, because there was none. It was a totem. It was a commemoration. And in this case, a pre-commemoration of what ultimately became the religious experience of Star Wars, which is basically a secular religion now, And as I've said more than once, I expected there to evolve a secular religion in the late 20th, early 20th century, but I expected it to revolve around Elvis, not Star Wars. So I didn't get any good until I had a big fight at Marvel, and it suggested I take a hike. I took a hike, and I spent a couple of years doing other things for a living, and I learned respect for technique, and I studied. I woodshedded. Like Sonny Rollins went under the Brooklyn Bridge and spent a year at 2 o'clock, from 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. Sonny Rollins would go to the middle of the Brooklyn Bridge and blow on his saxophone because he had a crisis of doubt about his own abilities, and he went and studied. And he just woodshedded. Austin Briggs, who in 1945 was the guy who was penciling and inking Flash Gordon and had a crisis of doubt. And he goes off and he rents a cabin in the woods, spends 2 years, and he comes out, and within 8 months, he's one of America's great American illustrators. I'm not that guy, but I woodshedded. I became a woodshedded talent. When I did, I came back and I did Flag. And what Flag is about is the synergy and synergistic relationship of the text and images. That's what it's about. It's when I came to understand that comics is not drawing, it's picture making. And it's picture making with that pictures are endowed with narrative value. And there are a lot of guys who draw better than I do, but they haven't got a fucking clue about how to make a page or a picture. And a picture is not something, a drawing that you put 4 lines around. A picture has context. It has narrative value and context. There's a reason why the figures and the elements are placed in that picture where they are. They are not accidentally placed. There's not an arbitrary set of organizing principles. The principles are there. And when I was doing the Marvel lecture, I spent 8 years doing twice-a-year seminars at Marvel talking about this very thing. We would discuss the idea that the relationship of size to space is an imperative, that space in comic books represents time, that the camera movement you operate from one panel to another directly relates to how you want the reader to feel about the material. And there are 6 people involved in a comic book. There's an editor, there's a writer, there's an artist, there's a colorist, there's a letterer, and there's a reader. The reader's job is to turn the page. And you as the talent have a responsibility to relate to the reader, to remind the reader that he's a participant in the experience. This may sound very esoteric and really fucked up, but it's real.
Oh yeah.
It's why comics grabbed us by the balls in the first place. Comics fandom and comics professionalism has more in common with the Jesuitry than it does, say, with rock fandom or stamp collecting or any of the shit like that. It is really a quasi-religious experience because you're involved in the product. You're not simply an observer. You are a participant in the adjustment. Video games take that to another level entirely, a level that makes me uncomfortable, I might add. But the participation of the reader in the material, the turning of the page, the very act of being able to roll it up and stick it in your back pocket when you go to the barbershop, it comes with you. You have a relationship with this material. And it's one of the things that creates proprietary fandom and toxic fandom. We tend to want to own and love the material we own and love so much. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, fan fiction exists for a reason. We want to extend beyond what preceded the element and what happened after. Okay. I'm rereading a novel right now that I hadn't read since its first publication, a novel called Suspects, which is by a guy that I consider the single best writer on film alive today. And he's an old man, so I want to be very nice to him, keep him alive as long as I can. And this book is called Suspects. And what it is, it's 85 characters from 55 films and what happened to them before and after the movie they were in. And it creates this connected universe of movies. And comics people know about that shit all the time. Because once the concept of universes began to evolve, once the concept of crossovers began to evolve, you know, when World's Finest Comics ceased to be a Batman story and a Superman story and became Superman and Batman best friends working together, treating Robin like shit on all those covers, you began to understand that there was community here, and it reflected the community we had outside. I can't speak for you guys, but I know when I was a comic book collector as a young kid and then a teenager, I had a community, I had a syndicate, a bunch of guys that we all got together. We were in competition for each other for sources, but we also fed each other's needs. You know, I memorialize this in the third issue of Hey Kids Comics Volume 3, okay, where I have a kid who's obviously supposed to be me, meeting a guy named Artie the Exterminator, who was a real person. Artie the Exterminator was a guy who was the first guy I ever knew who had he basically made his own Mylar Snugs, the early, like primitive homemades, okay? And he would do his trading copies, his selling copies of his collection, he would carry around in his extermination kit. So all of his books smelled like formaldehyde. And I mean, this was my first experience. I bought my first I bought my first Golden Age comics for a bag of change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. No bullshit.
No. Yeah.
So I mean, when I shit all over fandom, I was there, baby. You know, I'm not doing this I'm no outsider looking in, pal. You know,
Yeah.
I was there. You know, I mean, I had a religious experience when I discovered comic books at the age of 4, and that religious experience sustained me throughout my teens and my early 20s. You know, I mean, the very fact that, you know, I actually managed to get laid while still being a comic book fan is a true tribute to my own aggressive sense of charm. You know?
That is true. So as you're
please tip your way.
But as you're drawing now and getting better, so how did you start getting into the field? How did that come about?
Well, my first job was, I heard that Gil Kane's assistant had died in his sleep. This guy was a guy who was going to be a real player, a guy who had real potential. A couple of years older than me, a guy named Tim Battersby, who died at the age of 21 in his sleep from an undiagnosed heart ailment.
Oh.
He sort of existed in that world somewhere between Wallace Wood and Gil Kane, that look, okay. And I don't know what he was doing for Gil, but I called Gil up and asked him if he needed somebody. I came to work for him, and I was terrible. And I told him, I said, I thought my work was mediocre. He said, no, it's worthless shit. And I'm convinced in retrospect that the reason he hired me
was he needed someone to basically be a gopher more than anything else. But I think he hired me because I was a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn that he could speak freely to about his own sensibility. I'm not kidding, about his own sensibilities and prejudices. I'm quite serious.
Right.
You know, and I worked for him, and he introduced me to a number of people. And I went to work for Wallace Wood shortly thereafter. I did some ghost work for Gray Morrow. Gray was just a wonderful guy. And they introduced me to Neil, and I met Neil Adams rather at DC. DC, you guys are really young guys. DC used to have from 3 to 5 on Wednesdays, they would do tours of the office.
Yeah.
You go up there, and Jack Schiff, who was this do-nothing editor at DC Comics in those days, would walk you around the office. You know, I got to meet Murphy Anderson. Murphy had a coffee concession in the middle of DC. He sold people coffee. Neil was working up there, and I met all these guys. You know, Julie Schwartz, and you know, and later on, you know, I met Neil, and Neil would adopt lost causes. You know, he would take the forlorn hopes, and he would sort of shove people down other people's throat. He basically threatened Marty Boltinoff into giving me a job, and I was not good enough to do the job. The job didn't get published till ages later, and ultimately. I started working with Joe Orlando, who shaped me up quite a bit. You know, he showed me how to make a professional job out of something. Because doing work was impossible. Getting work was just as impossible. I was terrible. I had no skill set at all. And it wasn't, you know, I ultimately practiced. You know, it's like, you know, we live in a culture that mistakes discovery for invention. And the reality is that I had all of the desire, but none of the skill set to back up the desire. So my reach was far exceeded by my grasp. So what I had to do is develop the grasp to get to the reach. Right. And ultimately that meant embarrassing myself for a good decade until I came back to comics in the early 80s with American Flag. But Flag was also an anomaly in that it didn't look like a superhero comic book, because it certainly wasn't. And the audience has been so infantilized since the 1950s my discovery of comics was concurrent with the evolution of the Comics Code. So I'm a child of that world. And the Comics Code both infantilized the product and infantilized the audience. If the Comics Code had not come into being, there might never have been an underground comics movement. Because the guys who basically formed the underground comics movement would have been sticking around in comics and sticking around to see as comics became that there was a transgressive line in comics that would evolve in the context of mainstream material. I mean, the stuff that Lev Gleason and Charlie Byro were doing was a perfect line directly to the undergrounds. And you know, when you think about the underground guys, they all look to Kurtzman. They're all talking about Mad. None of them are talking about the war books, except for Corbin, who goes to the horror and the science fiction stuff. You know, but the underground guys had utter contempt for the mainstream stuff. And as I've said more than once, I'm too mainstream for the weird and too weird for the mainstream. So, but again, I mean, I don't read comic books anymore, but I derive the same pleasure I once did from making them. I like the making. I mean, right now, I spend my day, you know, drawing. Today is rough pencil day. And I delivered 2 rough comps for variant covers I'm working on for people. And, you know, I've gone from being a hobbyist to a professional to a hobbyist. And I'm good with that.
Wow. Go ahead, Steve.
Wow. One quick question. You made quite a leap, and anyone who's watching this right now will know what that leap is. You said that you just called up Gil Kane. Mm-hmm. How on earth did you have Gil Kane's phone number?
It's in the phone. It's in the phone book. Yeah. What the fuck?
Okay. So
I mean, where did you?
He Googled it.
And so when you called him up, he didn't say, "Hey, who in the hell are you? Why are you calling me?"
Yeah, I said, I heard your guy died. You need somebody. Remember how callous you were when you were 18? Remember how utterly thoughtless you were of other people? I was that guy. Remember how you meet a guy like you're immortal. You know, it's horrible, but you are. You know, you're just that callous.
Okay. Again, most of the people who are watching this show, I can still remember a phone book. Okay, but anyone else is going to be like, Well, there's no
I
internet.
fucking love it.
There's none of this. He must have known someone. But the fact that you were able to open up a book and go, that's his number, I'm just going to call him.
No,
That's
and as it turns out, I was house sitting for a friend of a friend who had this gigantic sheepdog about 4 blocks from where Gil was living. So I was able to walk over to his place. And and bear in mind, I mean, I had hair down on my shoulders.
Yeah.
I was 18. Okay. My costume consisted of fry boots, landlubber jeans or seafarer jeans, which were, bell bottoms that came down to, 3 feet below your heels, chambray work shirt, denim jacket, and a pair of gloves and a scarf. Okay. That was my outfit. All right. And Gil was the first guy I ever met who owned a dressing gown. He had an ascot. He was like this really snazzy dresser.
Yeah.
But again, but what I learned was how much of that was reinvention. And I went through my own version of that reinvention 8 years later, during the bicentennial. Because if you know Gil's story, Gil was an only child of immigrants whose parents never learned to speak English. He had a nose like a toucan. I mean, he looked like an anti-Semitic movie poster come to life. And in the late 40s, he got a nose job, and he went from being this kind of like, he was really tall. He was like 6'4". He's a big guy.
Yes, he was.
And he was as tall as that as a teenager. And he went from being this kind of like gangly sort of guy with a Ray Bolger face to a very good-looking guy. He's a good-looking man. He's a handsome fella. And it changed everything. And one of the things you have to understand is one of the universal truths of many guys, certainly of that generation, not of mine so much, was a sense of self-loathing. These guys had utter self-contempt. And they regarded anyone attempting to better themselves in any way as attempting to rise above one station. A guy, it's a phrase you don't hear much these days, a guy on the make. When you hear about a man on the make, what it means is a guy who's a striver, a guy who wants to make better of himself. Okay. And Gil knew that he wasn't a good artist. He was a terrible artist. But he also knew that he had discipline and hunger, like I did. He wasn't as bad as I was when he was terrible, but I was really terrible. And he ultimately taught himself to be good. But as I said to someone yesterday on Facebook, that teaching ended up at the hyperbolic, and his hyperbolic approach. There was only room for the generic. He could never learn to create quiet spaces the way Harvey Kurtzman did. Kurtzman's work is so fluid in its understanding of pacing and space that it has an intimacy that can be very seductive, like Eisner does as well, to a certain extent. But Kirby is all just like blah, it's orgasm with punching. And that informs so much of what is demanded of comic books since the Kirby era of the early 60s, that he never developed anything like a quiet moment. Okay. I mean, as I've said more than once, one of the connecting tissues of all the men that were my mentors, and none of them could write worth a shit. They were terrible writers, all of them. Gil could write essays and articulate what he had to say, but he could never translate that skill set onto paper. Gray was a terrible writer, and Woody was just awful. And Neil, please, I mean, Christ, that stuff. that Batman Odyssey was just some of the funniest shit ever. It was just terrible. So for me, I came to understand that one of the reasons I was getting work when I was, even though I wasn't very good, was that I made writers' lives very easy. Because I mean, for example, the Star Wars thing. I mean, I broke that script down. Roy never had any idea what the book was going to look like until he'd seen my first pages. I did the script breakdown of that. I've always had a good story sense, and when I had to work Marvel style, I knew how to make that stuff work. I hate Marvel style. I will refuse to work at it in any way anymore. I will only work full script. I write full scripts for myself, and when I work for other people, I will never work without a full script again. It's an insult to me and my abilities. If a writer asks me what I feel like drawing, I realize he's not serious. That's not his job. His job is to give me something to draw, not to ask me what I feel like drawing. What I feel like drawing is relevant to his narrative.
Yeah.
And that's just bullshit. That's patronizing nonsense. So I realized early on that I should be writing this stuff too. So I started, and that's what I did. And now my value, I believe, is informed by the relationship of text to picture. That the two things together is what makes lightning. And that's what it's at for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Before I give it to Nal, Howard, just so you know, Roy always said that too. He said how good of a storyteller you were. He said that you could do that so well, even when you guys didn't know what you were doing. Like when it comes to.
Look, I'm convinced that Roy was one of the first guys to recognize this, and I'm quite serious. I don't resent this at all. It was a benefit to me because it demonstrated the fact that I had a skill set that was transcended to my drawing. Okay, because my drawing just wasn't very good, but I knew how to tell. I had a good sense of shot calling. That shot calling stuff. I mean, right now, I've said this more than once. The two guys in comics who I believe are the most artist-friendly writers I've worked with are Mark Waid and Mark Guggenheim. Not that they're the best writers in comics, but that they both have, in very different ways, a genuine and real intellectual and intuitive understanding of the real estate of the page. You know how little the page is and how much you can demand of the page. Okay. And I've always understood that. And I don't know why. I mean, it might be the one actual talent that I have that is not learned, that is innate. It's possible. I don't know. But I've always had that. Even when I drew like a shithole, I could put together a page pretty well. I mean, interestingly enough, I've had an assistant for the past 6 years who is on the spectrum and is functioning. He's high functioning. Okay. And when he came to work for me, his work was just terrible. And in the 6 years, his drawing has improved slowly, mostly because of my pushing him on stuff. But he's learned how to make pages like a motherfucker. Mm-hmm. His pages are context, and they don't require defense. They don't require explanation. And I feel really proud of that because that's something he's clearly gotten from me. Okay. And again, it's something that I can see in the work of guys who work with me and for me. Dean Haspiel is another one. Jed Doherty, who is doing some amazing work with Aubrey Citizen right now. Jed is a guy who should have an enormous commercial footprint, and in a less conservative time, he might. His work is just extraordinary. It's very idiosyncratic, and we work in a business which objects to idiosyncrasy. It seeks a very much a familiar, almost cliched narrative. Okay, so yeah, I mean that crossover of skill sets is really what's important to me.
Go ahead now.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I really appreciate how you're talking about comics, right? And what comics are and about context and things like that, stuff that does seem lost in a lot of work that's out there. And so I really would like to know your opinion, because I see this all the time. I'm sure you see it, and maybe you've even debated people on it, people talking about the comic industry now and what it is. And you had mentioned something earlier about being the artist, and the fans turn the page, and the creators have to know what the fans want in this stuff. Do you think that creators and fans now have a disconnect when it comes to the comic book industry?
I don't know. I've lived in California more than half my life. Okay, I moved here the day before I turned 35, and I live in a small town. I lived here for 20 years. And I have an incredible social disconnect. I see my colleagues when I go to conventions, and most of that relationship is dinner, and it's just shit talk and shop talk for the most part. And to a great degree, I think that from what I've seen is that when I hear that what comics are selling, the stuff that does sell, is the stuff that's very transient, i.e. manga and anime, which reaches an audience that has a very brief shelf life and then moves on to other things. You and I, the four of us, all got into comics when we were children. Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, we're still playing and dealing with the same stuff we played with when we were children. And that audience has to be served and addressed by its own set of needs and desires. the relationship between talent and fandom is complex because I'm of the mind that doesn't really believe anyone who says that comics were a second choice. You know, you're inoculated by this shit. You're taken in. You're in. Your body is invaded and infected with this stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking? It's like holy shit. How long has this been going on? You know, whether you were at whether it was where you had getting a haircut at a barber shop, and somebody threw you a comic book to read while you were getting your haircut.
Yeah.
Or whether you were on a trip with your family and you picked up a comic book in a grocery store. Just that first moment is like, holy shit. This is something. I mean, how long has this been going on, and why didn't anybody tell me sooner? You know,
Yes. We've all had that moment. Started with the Sunday funnies.
It's just, it is. It's real, and it's universal. It's endemic. And I think, to a profound extent, the comic book marketplace was profoundly altered by the 90s, when comics became accidentally perceived as an investment tool. And the flurry of money that was made by a bunch of people under what ultimately turned out to be false pretenses, because the material has no intrinsic investment value, created this entire slabbing business. You know, that the material has gone from being a delivery system of content to an object, to an icon, to the equivalent of collecting Hummel figurines. And the audience, by the same token, has been, to a certain extent, undereducated by the public school system and doesn't really read deeply or critically in the material they look at. The way either side of the political arena reacts to any disagreement as a disavowal is deep. I mean, for example, nobody is okay with stuff. You either hate it or love it. You know, I ended up watching all of WandaVision after watching the first episode and realizing that I wanted to punch my television set in the face. And I ended up watching the whole series because my editor said, stay with it because I'll tell you a joke at the end of it that you'll really love. So I did. I watched all of it. He told me the joke. I have no recollection of the series whatsoever, and I've already forgotten the joke. But I recognized there were people out there who thought this shit was like the second coming.
Right.
And I'm just not that interested in this stuff. I just don't care that much. You know, I mean, I'm, you know, like Steve said, referred to me as the most anti-woke guy ever. That's not the case at all. I hate everybody universally. But the truth of the matter is, my politics are far to the left. They're just not that left, that particular version of the left. And as I've said more than once, I would love to see someone produce a really well-made right-wing comic book that was well-written, well-drawn, and well-crafted. It wasn't out to convince me politically, but was entertaining me within the context of its choice of politics. I'd like to see that. I really would. You know, because I'm willing to, my eyes are open enough to embrace all sorts of other ideas. You know, I recognize the fact that, we contain volumes. Let's enhance those volumes. So I really can't say, what that relationship is, because I'm not really involved on a day-to-day basis. Bear in mind, I aged out of Marvel and DC a decade ago. I stopped getting work in both those companies in 2012. So, you know, when I work at Image at the sufferance of Image, you know, they give me, they publish my stuff. I have no idea why, but they do. And, you know, I have no commercial footprint because I don't seek out, I don't deliver material that's aimed at a commercial audience. You know, I couldn't give a fuck what the audience cares about. It just doesn't. Right. You know, I just got a Facebook message from Chirello. He and I'm on a Facebook exchange group with Dave Johnson, Mark Chirello, and Bill Sienkiewicz. And Dave just bought a great Ed Diebel piece, which he's like, oh yeah, good stuff.
Now, Howard.
Yeah.
No, I was saying, speaking of that, was there any art that you ever collected or anything like that? Like, was there ever a piece that you wanted for yourself that you were into?
Other people's work, you mean?
Yeah.
I have a phenomenal collection of American illustration, not comics. I had a couple of pieces of comic art, but I've sold them all. I give them away. Hold on, my wife is calling. She has things to say about you. Give me a second. Hey, sweetie, I'm on that Zoom thing. Where are you?
This is fantastic. I tell you, this, I love it.
Oh? Hey, can you hear me? Where are you, honey? Oh, fuck. You coming home or you going to see the kids?
This is fantastic.
Well,
6:30.
you know, he's
All
talking about everything I think about. You know, it's definitely
Kyle,
great.
keep this in. Keep
I
this
say,
in.
I'm being watched by these three guys watching me talk to my wife on video. It's really fun. All right, so let me call you back. She's waving, by the way. She says very high to both these. I'll call you as soon as I'm off with these guys. Okay, I'll call you back. Okay. Are you coming directly home?
She is.
Okay, I'll see you in a bit. Thanks, honey. Bye. All right, bye. Bye.
It's like,
You know, you call me at night. This is what you get, babe. You know, what I mean? You're the one you're invading my house. You know.
yeah, right. Go ahead, Steve.
The one thing I noticed, now obviously, this is probably something that you don't give a damn about.
I love it.
But
Always a good setup.
yeah. And obviously, you've answered some of the questions because you said that at first, like the first 10, 15 years, you said your art was not very good at all.
Yeah.
However,
I got good after 10. Don't push.
Yes.
10 my break off. You know.
The one thing I noticed about your art is that it has never dropped off. Now, certain artists, they have a peak, and then when you say, "Hey, can you come back and do a project?" You look at it, and then in your heart, you say, "Ooh, that's not the same." When you did Avengers 1959, I looked at the art, and I was like, "He hasn't lost a step. He hasn't lost a step." Now, I don't know whether you were aware of that or you thought if you ever even entertained anyone thinking about that, but that's the first thing I thought when I was flipping through the pages. You haven't lost a step with your art. Most people don't. They can't keep up that quality. They slip off. They get tired.
It's because they're smugly satisfied with themselves, and I'm too terrified to be identified as an imposter. I mean, look, there's only one other guy. There's only one other guy in my generation right now who's regularly producing work that is not a parody of itself, and that's Walter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Walter and I are still producing work at the top of our game on a regular basis. There are good guys, but nobody's turning out work on a regular basis on that level in any way. You know, I've been trying to get fucking Kaluta to get out of his hellhole and start getting back to work. He's doing some amazing shit. And he needs to get out more and see people and let the people see that work. But he won't come out because he's hiding it home. But Walter and I are the guys. You know, we're doing the work, and it's true. I mean, and a lot of it for me really is come out of a fear of being identified as a loser and an imposter.
Oh.
You know, if I'm going to work in public, I might as well not embarrass myself.
All right.
I'm more than halfway through the third volume of Hey Kids right now. I'm in the second half of issue 4 right now. It's a 6-issue arc, and I've already lined up what's next. You know,
what inspired that series?
Years of sitting and listening to Gil Kane and Russ Heath and Neil Adams and Murphy Anderson and Liz Berube and all and Frank Giacoia, John Verporten, all those old motherfuckers, Mike Esposito, Ross Andrew, Julie Schwartz, everybody. I mean, you know, because basically, you know, you hang around and. Old people love having young people listen to them. You know, I speak as an old person. I know this, you know. And, you know, these guys, I mean, they were younger than I am now, but they were willing to talk. They talk about what it was like. Because I was smart enough to know that it wasn't like that anymore. That not like that anymore stuff is a really important thing for people to understand. There's that dearth of historical curiosity that we are suffering from right now is damaging to us, because the assumption is that, you know, the way it was either a hellhole or exactly the way it is now or perfect. And what people have to understand, it was just different. You know, when I work with writers who are younger than I am, who don't bother to do research to find out what language was actually like in my childhood. You know, it's ridiculous. You know, there's I just read Stephen Hunter's new novel, The Bullet Garden. And it's the best thing he's written in years. I'm a fan of Hunter's work, although he's written not great stuff of late. But his Point of Impact is probably the single first great thriller of the 1990s. And he has this whole thing about relationships, about people in war in London in 1944. And he makes a joke of it, that this is what sex was. This is what sex was. And what he's doing is he's doing a counter narrative to the assumption of sexual profligacy that is seen in much contemporary material that depicts a period world. I mean, Gil was under the mistaken impression that my generation was just fucking like rabbits. That all we had to do was to say "fuck me" and we were in the sheets. and I explained to him that you're buying into a bullshit narrative. You know, you really are. Just the same as I was buying into the bullshit narrative. My parents had sex 3 times, and that's why they had 3 kids. You know, it's just different. It's a different world, and I was fascinated by the way how different things were. You know, the fact that that Julie and Gil would argue constantly about who their favorite jazz musicians were, and they were passionate about it. They really had serious, and they only agreed on one thing. One thing. Everybody else was up for grabs. They just hated everybody. I hate what you like, but this one thing they really bought. And she's one of my favorite singers today, and listening to just Ramona's career arc in the 1950s, because Ramona's career arc is, but she's a comic book artist, but she was married to a guy who was a New Yorker guy, so her first husband was a New Yorker cartoonist. Mm-hmm. And Dana Frayton, so she had feet in both worlds, and getting a sense of what that was like. Talking to arts, to Al Williamson, to Mike Royer, what it was like on the West Coast, just different shit, and assuming that it was the same as we are. And when I was first when the first couple of issues of Hey Kids comics first started coming out, I had Greg Goldstein come up and had dinner with me. Greg used to be the publisher at IDW. And Greg's a good pal. And we were talking about the concept of bitterness, because so much of the arc, the theme of that first arc, is the bitterness and the misrepresentation and misunderstanding of the value of the work that was being done in the comic book business by those guys, because none of them had any idea. Every one of those guys thought that comic books was a pit stop on a race station. That there was something next. There was something coming up next. And I said to Greg, that the real difference is that my generation had none of that bitterness. And he said, of course, because you knew going in what you were going to get, that you were going to get fucked. And there's a certain truth in that. There really is. Yeah. That we may not have been a bunch of comic book loving guys the way Stan was trying to promote us, but we went in not blind. We went in with our eyes open, knowing what was coming up. Yeah. And a couple, and those of us who got disillusioned and angry about it were the guys who bought into that comics will break your heart kid shit, which is just nonsense. Right. Of course. I mean, if you're the subtext of that is, it's not going to break my heart because I'm special. I have very little patience with that narcissism out of Kirby, or even Woody's narcissism, Woody's bitterness, because this assumption was that they were not going to be affected by what was affecting everyone else. Right. And I'm not happy with a lot of shit that's happened in my career, but I'm the architect of my own adversity. Yeah. I knew the job was dangerous when I took it, just like Stupid Chicken said to Fred, and again, the Hey Kids comics is someone paid me an enormous compliment this morning on Facebook. He just read the first issue of the third arc, and he compared it to what Alan had done in that thing in his new book, that Thunderman thing, which I found I couldn't read it. I had a hard time getting through it at all, and he referred to the work that I was doing in Hey Kids as decent. In the sense of being kind to people, and I think that to a certain extent I'm working hard at doing that, to be as even-handed as I possibly can, because when I first announced the book, I had some shithead on Facebook presume that I was literally out to settle scores, and that is not the case. I'm not. I mean, I I hate a lot of people. I have a shit list. I mean, I don't want to wish anybody dead, but there's a lot of people who's over with I'd love to read the day after. You know what I'm saying? Just I'm in.
Oh,
But I'm not out there to hurt anybody's feelings or to cause anybody any real grief. If I'm going to hurt somebody's feelings, I want to do it on purpose.
right. Howard, I gotta ask you a question. First off, this is like always asking you a question. It's like one of those fast, those firecrackers with the fast wick. You don't know what's gonna happen if it's gonna blow up. So I have to ask you this.
I've never seen a firecracker in my life, so I have no idea what you're talking about. Go ahead, keep going.
Oh man. Okay. I know you and Roy didn't have it good with. I know when you guys made Jaxxon, the bunny that you guys did. What do you think though? I mean, now that Lucas doesn't have control, and I know he wanted to totally squash that.
I hated it so much; it was really.
Oh,
funny.
I know. It's so funny.
Roy sent me a picture of this after I'd seen it the day before of the Jaxxon action figure and shit.
Yeah, that's what I was going to tell you about.
It's par for the course. I mean, look, if Star Wars had come out a year later when the royalty system was in, I would have made millions of dollars. The royalties I made, the complete amount of royalties I made on the Star Wars stuff at Marvel in those days, I made a flat additional $15 a page per, and that was it. That's it, the end. Okay? So getting royally fucked by that kind of stuff was perfectly within the range of what I was expecting.
Right.
You know? But again, I don't think the work I did for it was very good. So there's a nice balance. Like that, like you go to a restaurant where the food is lousy and the portions are really small. I wasn't going to get worked up about it. I thought it was the best thing about the Jaxxon stuff, anecdotally. The one time I went to the New York show, too big for me, too much of a mosh pit for me. I went there, and I was there because I was in New York doing the Marvel seminar. And I'm sitting at my table, and this dame comes over, this very attractive woman who's dyed green, and she's wearing a Playboy bunny outfit, and she's got bunny ears. She's a professor at Columbia University who also moonlights as a stripper in that burlesque thing, the ironic burlesque movement, shit like this. And she's there as a Playboy bunny version of Jaxxon, which I thought was fantastic. I really dug it. It demonstrated a sense of self, a real wit, and I thought it was really charming and fun. I really loved it.
Well, now that it's a figure, because Lucas doesn't have any control. When I showed Roy that, he was cracking up too, and he's like, it's crazy, and and it came with the comic book too, and they're promoting Jaxxon now. You know, a new annual is coming out, and what's funny, one of Roy's signings, a kid wanted Roy to write something like Jaxxon saying something. He didn't know what to write, but he goes, "Eat your heart out, George Lucas. You can't stop him." It was great. You can't stop that bunny.
No, I think it's just the irony of this sort of stuff. Some shit just does not die. And let us not forget that Marvel, like the Star Wars people, these people are going to use every part of the pig, including the squeal. No, there will be no stone unturned, no stern untoned. Look, the very fact that they made Millie the model into a superheroine. They're going to squeeze juice out of a rock. Credit where credit is due. If I had access to all that shit, I'd do the same thing myself. But I don't, and I won't.
Yeah, he's coming. Okay, Steve, go ahead.
So you touched on it a little bit about how you came back to comics in the early 80s with American Flag. A lot of people, that's a very powerful and nostalgic thing in their reading life. A lot of people who are my age, who are reading Independence, it's like, wow, American Flag, la la la. It's a big deal for them. So if you could touch on exactly how that whole project started, how you got involved with the publisher, and like went, okay, I'm gonna come back and it's gonna be a different way of doing things.
Well, I think to this day, I still don't quite know why they had confidence in me enough to do it. I really don't. And I'm not being this is no false modesty. I am modest when modesty is called for. This is not false modesty. This is real. I was pals with Mike Gold, and we got along very well. And I have an odd sensibility. They approached me and I was married to a woman, and we were deeply in credit card debt because the work that I'd done for Byron Price had cost me an enormous amount of money. I never made a dime off of that shit. And I needed something to basically get out of that hole. And they offered me a financial package that was going to do so. And I mean, basically Flag comes out of, it's Terry and the Pirates meets Gunsmoke in space. That's really what it is. And I was very much a clothes horse at that time. I was extremely committed. I looked like a Eurotrash pimp. And I was very well dressed, and so was she. We were both very fashion conscious, so that informed a lot of the work. And it just happened. And it turns out that I got along very well with Rick Obadiah and all the people involved at the company. And it was a nice synergistic relationship. What is First Comics today has no bearing whatsoever on what was First Comics then. Obviously, it's a totally different idea. I'm going to be doing the Baltimore show this year because it's for the 40th anniversary of that First Comics.
Oh, nice.
And it's worthy of tribute. It really is. It was a great company. I was living in New York City at the time, and I'd fly to New York to Chicago every couple of months. Back in the day, that was really a cheap trip. You just get on a plane, just jam over there from LaGuardia.
Right.
And I socialized with those cats. I spent a lot of time in their company, and it was a great company. It was a real, a guerrilla outfit. It really was. And I can say without a moment's hesitation that Flag was the best thing they ever published. I don't give a shit with anybody else. It was not the most commercial, because the audience is so programmed to identify. I mean, I just published a piece this morning on Substack, and I told an anecdote about a panel I did, the first Comics panel I did, where I introduced the character, and one of the people in the audience says, "What were Flag's superpowers?" And I said that he can remove his underwear without taking his pants off, and he can make ice cream. And I got the laugh I wanted, but underneath that laugh was my contempt for that guy in the audience.
Yeah.
And I posed it as comic disdain, but it was genuine contempt.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a lesson I didn't learn, to my detriment. That the audience wanted something with guys with shit coming out of their eyes. They weren't interested. And I mean, comic book fans like titillation. They like pinups. They like cock teasing. But when someone introduces the actual idea of genuine lust and genuine desire and the complexities of desire, certainly in mainstream stuff, they get very uncomfortable. I don't like this. This is creepy. Yeah, I don't know. This reminds me too much of sweating. That kind of stuff. So. That's it. So I got time for one more shot, and then I gotta go.
Yeah, go ahead now.
So did Black Kiss make them uncomfortable? You're serious?
Oh fuck! You do know how to open a can of worms, don't you, young man?
You said you had to go. I was like, now I'm gonna keep you longer.
Yeah.
Wait till we get onto television, huh?
Yeah.
No. I'll stick around. Okay, fuck it. You got me, or whatever. See how long it takes my wife to get home. That's the Black Kiss was an attempt to slap comic books in the face. I was feeling my oats. I was in the last stages of a lifelong alcoholism, and I was out of control. And I just had the best time ever. It was just great. And I did most of it while I was living in Southern California, so that it reflected an enormously heightened paranoia about living in Los Angeles, which is, I don't live in Los Angeles anymore, but LA always made me a lot more paranoid than New York ever did. When you grew up in your 20s in New York City in the 70s, nothing's gonna fuck with you until I got to LA. Yeah. And Black Kiss was just, it didn't start out to be quite as hardcore as it became. Then I just said, what the fuck? It's hardcore. Let's go there and just do it. And again, I had a great time doing it. I was glad we did it the way we did it. My editor was one of the best people I've ever known in my life, who died incredibly young, Lou Stathis, who was the guy who trained Axel Alonso, and who was to a profound extent far more responsible for the vibe and ethos of Vertigo Comics than anyone up there, including those are the names. Lou was really the secret engine behind all that stuff. Just an absolutely brilliant guy, who over dinner once, he told me and my then wife they were the darkest spirited people he'd ever met. And we both turned it to, we think so about you too. You know, so it was like, here we are, you know, I was like, oh, it was great. But I had a great time doing it. And, you know, and it was a great way to say goodbye to comics for a while, because then I ended up working in television for the next 12 years, working on shit I'd never watch. And, you know, but grateful for the money, because to tell you the truth, I live in a house at the beach. I own it outright with no mortgage. And that's all because of working in television that I wouldn't watch. And the television that I worked in no longer exists. That market is no longer there. It's vanished. The market is in totally different. It's a different model right now. And if I were around today at 40 and I had my CV, I'd have a housekeeping deal at any studio I wanted. But in those days, they didn't know what to make or do with people who had my skill set. The assumption was that if you did comic books, you were a superhero person, that you could write the Flash in a heartbeat. And that was, you know, I didn't give a shit about that stuff, you know. All my samples were 10 o'clock shows, but all the work I got was syndicated junk. And, you know, that was just the way it was. I'm okay with that.
Wow. All right, Howard, we'll let you go. I just want you to know you're one of my most entertaining guests. I hang on everything you're going to say because it's fantastic. And you
got to remember, having met most of my colleagues, that's a pretty low bar. You know, it doesn't take much to transcend. Now, I mean, I'm assuming you guys are more on the political right than the left, so I'm assuming the comments you're going to be getting are going to be really appalling. Like, why are you having that asshole on your show? And let him know why. It'll be fun to hear how the answers go.
Oh, believe me, we get. Thank you so much. You are a legend, and I can't wait to see you in Pennsylvania.
I look forward to you, John. And again, gentlemen, I want to tell you, I take nothing for granted. I don't mistake attention for affection, although I often say I do. And I'm grateful for the attention. This is a well-spent hour. I had a ball talking to you guys. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I truly did.
I must admit, I think, and this is no crap, I think this is the deepest level I think we've got into the actual art of comics itself.
Yeah.
And I think that when we get our people watching this, it's going to be an eye-opening experience. And I'm very happy with the way we just let you go and that you explain things so we get an idea. And you were talking about stuff that it's going to take, you know, some people about 4 or 5 years to catch up with it, but they're going to get it. So
I'll be dead by then.
Yeah, no, you look very good, by the way, and you're sharp as a nail. So
I'm rotting inside, baby. I'm rotting inside.
I'm really looking forward to the reaction of this issue. I really am.
Thank you.
Well,
all right,
if you do sequels, consider catching up with me again. I'd love to come back. This was a gas.
Oh yeah, we got to get into your TV stuff too. That's fantastic.
Vomitocious, baby.
All right, Steve, get us out of here.
All right,
I hope to hear from you to do this one more time. Thanks again.
Definitely.
I'm out.
Boom.